COVID-19 has exposed the truth that the rest of the world depends heavily on supply chains from China. Currently, US-China economic relations are strained due to numerous mutual trade sanctions. Experts believe that Washington is angered by China's unfair competitive behavior, such as intellectual property theft, forced technology transfer, or unreasonable tariff barriers. The Americans' anger has been suppressed and erupted during the term of former President Donald Trump. From this point, a trend of decoupling between the two economies officially began. However, if we look more closely at history, from more than a decade ago, a trend in China to separate from the US economy may have been officially initiated. A retired Chinese official shared with Nikkei Asia that President Xi Jinping was the one who made the first significant statements, paving the way for the process of the two economies gradually decoupling from each other. However, this idea had already emerged before Xi Jinping took office in 2012. It all started around the party's 18th National Congress. During the quinquennial event, Xi, the leader in waiting, raised concern that the Chinese economy was being hijacked by the US. As leader, he was determined to correct the situation. Xi's statements were behind closed doors and not publicized, but with 3,000 delegates attending the National Congress, it had many people talking about it. At the time, however, people in China did not realize that Xi's intentions could have massive consequences for China's economy and society later on. It was in the era of President Hu Jintao, and unlike now, unfettered discussions were still possible, as long as they were held only within the party. Thus, Xi's remark about the Chinese economy being hijacked became widely known. At the heart of Xi's frustration was former Paramount leader Deng Xiaoping. Deng, who was born in 1904 and died in 1997, introduced a policy of reform and opening up in 1978 and laid the groundwork for China becoming the world's second-largest economy. Despite the international praise of Deng, Xi believed that the Western-oriented economic structure Deng installed led to corruption, worship of money, and blind admiration of Western systems within the party and military. By the US, the logic goes, Deng's policies were to blame for the Chinese economy being hijacked or dominated. From Xi's perspective, US companies were operating freely in the Chinese market and make huge profits. China's group of private companies, too, were doing business at home and abroad, outside the party's control. The conclusion was drawn that unless these issues were all corrected, the country's one-party rule was at risk. China's efforts have since led to a strong reversal of policies from the opening up era. China has become more close to foreign businesses. Google, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and a series of Western companies have been banned from operating. Foreign direct investment companies in China must collaborate and share technology with domestic partners. While the path to decoupling was not clear back in 2012, in retrospect, Xi's inner circle was beginning to consider reducing China's economic dependence on the US. 5 years later, when the party held its next National Congress in 2017, the Xi administration began to push for military-civilian fusion. Tapping China's private sector for military-grade technologies was a way for the Chinese military to reduce dependence on the US. In addition to reduced dependency, China has to accelerate its self-reliance efforts. China does this by spying and stealing technological secrets. Successive Chinese spies have been arrested in Europe and the United States while trying to obtain sensitive technologies ranging from propulsion to aerospace. Sensing the unfriendly move, the US began to cut off cutting-edge technology from China. This has enormously impacted the private sector. Trump, who came into power that year, continued this trend with tariffs on Chinese goods and a trade war. Xi's prescriptions for tackling US dependence has always been self-reliance. He has also tried dual circulation, an economic policy that seeks to reduce the role of foreign trade in driving the Chinese economy. But whatever Xi's visions for an ideal Chinese economy were, the reality was that the Chinese economy, being so dependent on the outside world, was not going to function properly if self-reliance was the guiding philosophy. In 2020, Ant Group, a financial affiliate company of Chinese e-commerce giant Alibaba Group, was abruptly forced to delay its planned listing with no rational reason given. The contradiction between being under party control and abiding by Western disclosure rules came to the fore in the fate of US-listed Chinese companies. One by one, major Chinese state-owned companies that could not meet information disclosure requirements set by US regulators were delisted from stock markets in the country. Earlier this year, Alibaba founder Jack Ma was forced to give up control of Ant by relinquishing most of his treasured shares in the financial company. Alibaba also announced a decision to split itself into 6 business groups. In the world of semiconductors, the US-China battle for technological supremacy has made it difficult for multinationals to supply high-performance chips to China. As a result, China's leading telecommunications equipment makers lost significant shares of the global smartphone market. Restrictions on semiconductor supplies to China by the Chip 4 alliance of the US, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan remain a major topic. To some extent, the US is probably not hijacking the Chinese economy today, but it has also become difficult for Chinese companies to expand operations around the world without restrictions. This has become a drag on Chinese economic growth. In the 11 years under Xi, the fundamental principle that moves China has changed. The party's political logic takes precedence over any logic of economic freedom. The economy is but a tool to complement communist-led politics. Xi has already acquired ultimate power, and those around him are all his close aides. There is no one who can fundamentally correct the basic policy that the top leader has pushed ahead for political reasons. This can be advantageous, but sometimes it also has negative effects on the economy. Even Premier Li Jiang, who is ranked second after Xi in the party hierarchy and is in charge of the economy, is no exception. Li is a former personal secretary to Xi, more of an executive officer than a full-fledged board member in corporate terms. Official figures released by China showed that the country's economy grew 4.5% in real terms in the January-March quarter. The growth rate was higher than initially expected, as service consumption, such as eating out and travel, picked up due to the end of the zero-COVID policy. But property development remains mired in the doldrums, and private sector investment is not growing. Small and mid-sized manufacturing companies, which have supported the Chinese economy, are also in serious slump. If they do not get back on their feet, it will become impossible to secure jobs for a huge number of new university graduates and others. Foreign companies, including Japanese ones, are gradually shifting some production from China to Southeast Asia and India. It emerged in March that a veteran male employee of Astellas Pharma, a major Japanese drug maker, was detained by Chinese authorities immediately before he was due to return to Japan from Beijing. He has worked in China for more than 20 years. The Astellas detention is beginning to seriously impact Chinese companies operating in China. The owner of a small to medium-sized Japanese company operating in China told Nikkei on condition of anonymity that they are moving production from China's Zhejiang province to Vietnam. We were already shifting away and from China. Everything is more expensive and there are political risks. The Astellas detention will only accelerate this trend. Since his pledge to fight American hijacking 11 years ago, Xi has followed through. US-China decoupling has progressed step by step. Non-American companies are also caught up in the storm. Although the latest data show growth picking up, The outlook for the Chinese economy is far from bright. What will happen to it over the next 4 to 5 years? That depends on where Xi takes his politics.
Mặc dù dữ liệu mới nhất cho thấy tăng trưởng GDP của Trung Quốc khá ấn tượng, nhưng triển vọng của nền kinh tế thì chưa hẳn đã sáng sủa. Điều gì sẽ xảy ra trong 3 đến 4 năm tới nếu các doanh nghiệp nước ngoài tiếp tục rút khỏi? Khả năng không nhỏ sẽ phụ thuộc vào việc ông Tập chỉ đạo nền kinh tế đi theo con đường nào.
Recently, the White House has asked South Korea to urge its chip makers not to fill any market gap in China if Beijing bans Idaho-based Micron from selling chips, as it tries to rally allies to counter Chinese economic coercion. The U.S. made the request as President Yoon Suk-yeol is preparing to visit Washington upon invitation and will have a summit meeting with the President Joe Biden. China last month launched a national security review in Micron, one of the three dominant players in the global DRAM memory chip market, with South Korea's Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix. It is unclear if the Cyberspace Administration of China will take punitive action after its probe, but the stakes are high for Micron, as mainland China and Hong Kong generated 25% of its $30.8 billion in revenue last year. U.S. officials and business executives believe the CAC probe is Beijing's retaliation against the tough actions that President Joe Biden has taken to help prevent China from obtaining or producing advanced semiconductors. The Micron case has emerged as a litmus test of whether Beijing is willing to take coercive economic measures against a major U.S. company for the first time. The U.S. has asked Seoul to encourage Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix to hold back from boosting sales to China if Micron is banned from selling as a result of the investigation. The White House request comes at a sensitive time, with Yoon arriving in Washington on 24th of April. This is the first time the United States has asked an Asian ally to influence companies in the U.S.-China technology war. The White House did not comment on the specifics, but said the Biden and Yoon administrations had made historic progress deepening cooperation on national and economic security issues, including efforts to protect leading-edge technologies. It is unclear how Seoul has responded. U.S. and South Korean officials are discussing many issues, including how the U.S. can give Seoul more assurance about extended deterrence, the U.S. nuclear umbrella, as North Korea ratchets up tensions on the peninsula. The Micron-related request puts Yoon in a complicated position. He took office last year on a platform widely regarded as more hawkish on China than that of his left-leaning predecessor, Moon Jae-in. Illustrating his stance, he provoked an angry response from Beijing last week by accusing China of attempting to change the status quo over Taiwan by force. But his administration has also chafed at the U.S. efforts to rally allies behind its economic security agenda, amid fears that the long-term competitiveness of Samsung and SK Hynix could be undermined by the U.S. export controls. While Samsung and SK Hynix will not welcome efforts to curtail their business in China, the U.S. may have some leverage. When the U.S. unveiled sweeping chip-related export controls on China last October, it gave South Korean companies with chip fabrication facilities in China waivers to allow them to export from the country. Those waivers must be renewed later this year. Memory chip manufacturers are already under pressure due to an industry glut that in the first quarter of this year triggered a 25% decline in the price of DRAM chips, which are used in everything from TVs to phones. Last week, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said Washington was concerned about a recent uptick in coercive actions targeting U.S. firms. One person familiar with the situation said the request to Seoul reflects the fact that the Biden team was motivated to ensure that China is not going to be able to use Micron as a lever to influence or affect U.S. policy. China has used economic coercion against Taiwan and other countries, including Lithuania and Australia, but it has refrained from taking major action against the U.S., even as Biden has unveiled tough chip export controls and imposed sanctions on other Chinese companies. One source from Beijing said they were losing patience at what they saw as U.S. efforts to crack down on Chinese companies, suggesting that it was considering retaliation. The U.S. request to Seoul underscores how chips are at the heart of some of the deepest fault lines between Washington and Beijing. And this has come to an end of our program today. Thanks for watching and see you next time.